In the city of Pella, the capital of Macedonia, a boy was born who would one day change the map of the world. His father was King Philip II, a hardened warrior and shrewd politician who had transformed a land of scattered tribes into a disciplined and formidable kingdom. His mother, Olympias, carried with her a sense of mysticism and fervor. She whispered to her son that he was destined for greatness, that his lineage was not entirely of mortals, but connected to the gods themselves. The boy grew beneath the weight of these words, shaped by both the ambitions of his father and the visions of his mother. From his earliest years, stories of Homer's heroes surrounded him like a second skin. He listened to tales of Achilles, the warrior whose wrath and glory defined the epics, and he longed to mirror such feats in his own life. While other children indulged in games, his childhood was marked by training and discipline. He was taught to handle weapons with precision, to ride horses with fearless command, and to move as though born for battle. Physical endurance, courage, and mastery of war were not options for him, but expectations. Yet the boy's education was not confined to steel and strength. Philip ensured his son would be taught by one of the greatest minds of their age, the philosopher Aristotle. Under his guidance, the boy discovered a different form of power, knowledge. He learned about philosophy, natural science, ethics, and the workings of the world. He was encouraged to question, to search for truth beyond tradition, and to believe that reason could illuminate paths that force alone could not. Aristotle instilled in him the conviction that greatness was not merely conquest, but also understanding. Even so, the environment in which the boy grew was not one of peace. The court of Macedonia was filled with intrigue, jealousy, and shifting loyalties. He witnessed how easily men could betray one another, how alliances were bought and broken, and how blood was often the price of power. His father's throne, though strong, was always surrounded by whispers of rebellion and plots of enemies. Through these early lessons, the boy came to understand that kingship was as much as a struggle against those within as it was against enemies beyond the borders. In this atmosphere of ambition, learning, and constant danger, the boy's character hardened. He absorbed the tales of myth, the teachings of philosophy, and the ruthless realities of politics. He grew with the knowledge that he was meant for something larger than himself, that his life would not be ordinary, and that the path before him was carved in both destiny and blood. When Alexander reached youth, the course of his life shifted forever. His father, Philip II, was struck down under mysterious circumstances, and the young man, barely 20 years old, suddenly bore the weight of the Macedonian throne. For many, his age suggested fragility, a ruler who could be molded or removed. Yet Alexander revealed a steel within him that belied his years. No sooner had his father's funeral rites been completed than murmurs of rebellion stirred across the kingdom. Neighboring tribes tested the resolve of the new monarch, and rival claimants whispered treachery within the court. Alexander responded with speed and ruthlessness. He rode at the head of his army, crushing uprisings before they had time to spread. Cities that doubted him were subdued, and rebellious leaders found themselves executed or exiled. He sent a clear message: Macedonia would not fracture under his reign. His grip on power was not one of hesitation, but of decisive action, and those who had hoped to manipulate him quickly discovered the futility of their ambitions. Within his borders, conspiracies continued to coil around him. Friends of yesterday became potential betrayers, and loyalty was tested at every turn. Alexander navigated these dangers with a blend of caution and ferocity. He rewarded the faithful, punished the disloyal, and secured his throne not by inheritance alone, but by proving himself in the furnace of conflict. The throne of Macedonia was never a seat of comfort. It was a battlefield, and he had already begun to master it. Yet Alexander's vision stretched far beyond the mountains and plains of his homeland. The boundaries of Macedonia were too small to contain his energy and ambition. His father had laid plans for a vast campaign against the Persian Empire, the most powerful dominion the world had ever known. Alexander took this blueprint and made it his own. What had been Philip's ambition now became his destiny. Declaring his intention to fulfill the grand campaign, he gathered his army and crossed into Asia. The campaign was not waged from a throne room, but from the dust and blood of the battlefield. Alexander fought not as a distant sovereign, but as a soldier among his men, his presence at the front lines inspiring them to endure and to believe in a destiny greater than themselves. The first clashes against the Persians echoed across the world. Victories came swiftly, carved out by the combination of Macedonian discipline and Alexander's relentless courage. He became a symbol of invincibility, a figure who embodied both king and warrior. For the first time, Europe realized that before them stood not just a youthful monarch, but a force that dared to challenge the very foundations of the Persian Empire. The victories of Alexander grew into legend, each battle shaping him into a figure larger than life. At the river Granicus, he struck the first decisive blow against the Persian satraps, cutting through their cavalry with relentless force. Word of his triumph traveled swiftly, and his reputation as an unstoppable commander began to take root. At Issus, his fame reached even greater heights. There, he faced King Darius III himself, the ruler of the vast Persian Empire. The clash was fierce, but Alexander's strategy and ferocity shattered the Persian lines. Darius fled the battlefield, abandoning not only his army but even his own family, who fell into the hands of the Macedonian king. The defeat humiliated Persia and elevated Alexander into a conqueror whose name resounded across continents. As his victories multiplied, so too did his ambitions. He pressed ever forward, advancing through lands unfamiliar to his men, where mountains rose like walls and deserts stretched endlessly under the sun. Each obstacle became a symbol to be conquered, each river a boundary to be crossed. His army, hardened by constant campaigns, carved a path across Asia, while behind them Alexander left cities as testaments to his presence. Many bore his name, intended to stand forever as monuments to his legacy. In Egypt, he was received not as an invader, but as a liberator. The people welcomed him, and priests hailed him as a figure touched by divinity. On the shores of the Nile, he founded the city of Alexandria, destined to become one of the greatest centers of knowledge, commerce, and culture in the ancient world. His vision was no longer limited to conquest. It embraced the weaving together of cultures and the creation of enduring foundations. Meanwhile, Persia, once the unshakable empire, crumbled beneath his relentless campaign. After a final pursuit, Darius met his death, betrayed by his own men. The Persian king never reclaimed his throne, and with his fall, the empire of his ancestors passed into the hands of the Macedonian conqueror. Alexander stood as master of a realm that stretched from Greece to the edges of Asia, a dominion unparalleled in its scale. Yet with the scope of his power came a transformation within the man himself. Victories fed his belief that he was more than mortal, chosen by fate to stride across the world like a god among men. He began to demand honors reserved for the divine, seeing himself reflected not only in the heroes of Homer, but in the gods of Olympus and beyond. His soldiers still followed him, bound by respect and awe, but in their hearts the weight of unease grew. They revered his brilliance, yet feared the ambition that seemed to have no end. And the distance between king and men widened with each step of their march. As Alexander pressed further eastward, the nature of his struggle shifted. His battles were no longer only against foreign kings and armies, but against the growing fatigue of his own men. They had followed him for years across vast distances, through scorching deserts, towering mountains, and unfamiliar lands. Each step forward took them farther from their homes, their families, and the lives they once knew. Glory crowned their king, yet for the soldiers it was a heavy price paid in blood, exhaustion, and longing for return. In India, this strain reached its breaking point. The army, though undefeated, grew weary of endless campaigns. Monsoons drenched their camps, foreign terrain tested their endurance, and the promise of further conquest began to feel like an unending burden. For the first time, the men resisted their leader's will. They refused to march farther into the unknown, standing firm even before a king who had never before accepted denial. Alexander, torn between ambition and the reality of his men's defiance, was forced to turn back. Though he yielded to their demand, the retreat weighed upon him like a personal defeat. In his heart, he feared that the vision of conquering the entire world was slipping beyond his grasp. This frustration began to corrode the bonds that had long held his companions close. His temper grew harsher, his suspicion deeper. Friends who once shared his table and victories now faced his wrath. Accusations of disloyalty spread, and even the most trusted confidants lived in fear of his anger. The brilliance that had inspired loyalty now cast shadows of dread. His greatness, once shared with his comrades, turned into a solitary burden. Alexander's march home was marked not by triumph alone, but by a new sense of isolation. The young hero who had set out to emulate Achilles returned with scars not only upon his body, but upon his spirit. The weight of empire, the distance from his men, and the relentless march of time pressed heavily upon him. He was no longer the boy of Pella or the fearless conqueror of Issus, but a man caught between the vastness of his achievements and the haunting knowledge that even kings could not conquer eternity. Returning to Babylon, Alexander stood at the heart of an empire that stretched farther than any before it, from the mountains of Greece to the distant plains of India. Yet the vastness of his dominion brought him no peace. The city, rich and vibrant, became both a center of his power and a prison of his restless ambition. Even as his conquests lay behind him, his thoughts raced ahead. He spoke of new campaigns, of pushing beyond the known world, of reaching the fabled ocean that marked the Earth's edge. His spirit still sought horizons, but his body began to falter. Illness crept upon him without warning, striking down the man who had once seemed untouchable. Fever weakened his frame, and the king who had faced countless dangers in battle now lay confined to his chamber, unable to rise. Physicians clustered around him, offering remedies and prayers, yet none could halt the decline. His companions, hardened by war, watched helplessly as their leader, who had been the embodiment of strength, now lay vulnerable and silent. The army, stationed nearby, waited anxiously, unable to imagine a world without the man who had led them across continents. The question of succession hung like a storm over the court. Alexander had fathered no legitimate heir of age, and the enormity of his empire made the uncertainty unbearable. Generals and courtiers whispered among themselves, weighing their chances, measuring loyalties, and preparing for the inevitable fracture. When asked directly to whom he would leave his power, legend claimed that he spoke a single haunting phrase: "To the strongest." Whether he truly uttered it or not, the words captured the chaos to come. His final days were marked by a heavy silence. Friends and soldiers came to his bedside, each one filing past to look upon him one last time. Some wept, others prayed, but all felt the same dread. The age of their conqueror was ending. The man who had never turned back from any enemy now faced an adversary no sword could strike. As the fever consumed him, Babylon held its breath. In the shadows of its towering walls, hopes and fears mingled, but none could deny the truth pressing upon them. The greatest empire of its time stood on the edge of uncertainty, and the man who had built it, piece by piece, breath by breath, was fading into legend.
Alexander's death came with a swiftness that the world could scarcely comprehend. He had not yet reached his 33rd year when the breath of life left him, and in that moment, an empire built with relentless energy began to fracture. The news spread across continents, shaking cities and courts that had once trembled at the sound of his name. Soldiers who had marched with him across deserts and mountains found themselves adrift, and generals who had once bowed to his will now turned their eyes toward one another, each seeking a fragment of the power he left behind. The empire he had carved with sword and vision was too vast to endure without the force of his presence. His commanders, the Diadochi, divided the lands, tearing apart the unity he had forged. Kingdoms rose from the ruins of his dominion, each claiming a portion of his glory, yet none able to mirror the immensity of his ambition. The dream of a world under one crown dissolved into rivalry and war. But in that dissolution, his legend only grew. To some, he remained a ruthless conqueror who left behind fields of ruin and cities in ashes. To others, he was the bridge between worlds, the man who had carried Hellenic culture across the East and brought distant civilizations into contact. His cities, many bearing his name, endured for centuries, thriving as centers of learning, commerce, and culture. Alexandria in Egypt stood as the most luminous of these legacies, where knowledge and art flourished long after his body had turned to dust. His image entered myth, shaping stories told around hearths and in royal courts. He was likened to Achilles, to Heracles, even to the gods themselves. Scholars debated his motives, rulers imitated his strategies, and generations looked to him as both a model of greatness and a warning of its cost. His insatiable pursuit of glory became a timeless lesson, that the boundaries of human ambition could be pushed farther than anyone had believed, but always at a price. Though his life ended abruptly, his shadow stretched endlessly across history. In the silence left by his passing, the world recognized that his existence had altered its course forever. He became not merely a man remembered, but a symbol etched into eternity. His name carried across millennia as the measure of power, ambition, and the unyielding desire to conquer both earth and destiny.